Climate change is having a major effect on our oceans, and it's likely to get worse. California's National Guard is widely deployed to battle wildfires. And a changing climate has millions on the move across the globe. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. All this week, KPBS joined hundreds of news organizations from across the globe to confront the realities of climate change. I'm Mark Sauer. KPBS reporters join me on the Roundtable today to share what they've discovered. Joining me is Eric Anderson, Priya Sridhar, Steve Walsh, and Matt Hoffman. As humans continue to pump massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the worst effects have been masked by the oceans, which cover 2/3 of the planet. The oceans have absorbed about 30% of the carbon dioxide emitted over the past century. But there is a limit, of course, to what the great seas can take in. Already, we are seeing the effects of the oceans absorbing more than 2 million tons of carbon a year. I should say that's 2 trillion tons. Vast difference there. Now, Eric, your story this week localized this on a local oyster hatchery. Explain that local scale and how that's an example of this.
Sure. We looked at a business that relies on the ocean for its livelihood. It's a hatchery in Carlsbad. They grow oysters and mussels there inside that lagoon, Agua Hedionda Lagoon. And this is an issue that has been kind of in the forefront for them since 2007. The reason is, back in 2007, they used to get all of their oyster seed, basically the small, tiny oysters that they grow to full size, from a place in the Pacific Northwest. Well, the ocean changed in the Pacific Northwest. It became more acidic. And what they were finding was that this oyster seed source was failing. They couldn't produce it because they weren't reacting well to the acidic ocean. And that was kind of a wake-up call. There was a shortage of oysters at that time. People have since adjusted. They've moved the hatchery to a different location off the coast of Hawaii. The Carlsbad facility actually seeds their own oysters. That's one thing that they've done as a result of that. But it was a wake-up call for an industry that relied on the ocean and recognition that things are changing in the ocean. And
we should note, in the research, we learned of the 7.7 billion people on this planet, 3 billion have protein, their core protein, that is from seafood. So I think that speaks for itself, that statistic. Scientists at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, UC San Diego, they study this extensively. How concerned are they about how rapidly the warming and the acidification is happening?
Well, yeah, there are a couple of things happening. Acidification is one, and we can see how that directly impacts businesses that rely on the ocean. Warming is another one, and what warming is doing is it's changing the underwater ecology. Fish that used to survive off the coast of San Diego maybe are moving a little bit further to the north, and fish that used to be south of here are moving a little bit further this way. As the ocean warms, it also has less oxygen in it. Less oxygen means it can support less life. And so they'll become less prolific than they were in the past. And I think that researchers I've talked to are concerned about the fact that the ocean, which covers a large chunk of our planet's surface, have acted as sort of this regulator, this tool that allows the planet to kind of compensate. When things get warmer, the ocean can draw some of that heat in. When things get cooler, the ocean can release some of that heat to keep the changes around the planet's climate from changing too much. But as the ocean fills up with carbon dioxide and heat, it loses its ability to do that. So the changes that we see moving forward could be much more dramatic.
Now, we got more than 70 miles of coastline in San Diego County. We're especially vulnerable to rising seas. And Matt, tell us what's happening in Imperial Beach. You did some interviews there this week.
Yeah, we headed out with the captain of the lifeguards in Imperial Beach. Imperial Beach, I'm sure most people know, it's one of the lowest lying cities in all of California. They're surrounded by water on 3 sides, so they really don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah, I think your story said, 40 feet is the highest point in the whole city?
Yeah, the lifeguard says 40 feet is the highest point in the entire city, which isn't very high. And the captain of the lifeguards isn't just in charge of all the lifeguards in the city, but he's also in charge of all the crews that not only have to clean up after these big floods due to these high king tides, but who also have to prepare. So he kind of took us around and he showed us some of the places. He's lived there his whole life. He's been a lifeguard for 37 years. He's no climate expert, but he said that he's seen that these events get worse and worse over time. And that can be due to a variety of reasons. We were able to talk to some experts from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography who say that right now sea level rise has gone up about a foot over the last century, but in the coming next 100 years or in this century, that could be multiple feet. We don't really know. And if that if that happens, Imperial Beach could be in a lot of danger. Right now, they use a bunch of different barriers, sand, seawalls, but there's also a big sand problem that we have. There's a worldwide shortage of sand. And Imperial Beach in the past, they've dumped sand on their beaches, but it just gets washed away. So if you have these rising oceans, that's just going to make this flooding even worse with less sand.
And that's not the only place along our long miles of beaches and coastline that is going to see rising seas and sand diminishment. Of course, we've seen sand programs many times costing many millions of dollars to try to replenish the sand along the beaches.
Right, yeah, pretty much anywhere that's low lying on the coast. So we're talking spots in Carlsbad, Mission Beach, San Diego Bay. Del Mar is even tackling problems with sea level rise. But yeah, it's definitely a problem. The interesting part when you talk about cities like Del Mar, you hear a lot about things like managed retreat. That's the city looking to tackle the problem of moving these homes back further away so that they can deal with this sea level rise. In Imperial Beach, the lifeguard captain says that's a very touchy subject. And I know me and Eric were talking about before the show.
Yeah, Eric's covered this story
Eric's
too,
covered this extensively. And it seems like Imperial Beach, although there might be some chatter about it, they haven't really taken it on from a city perspective. So it'll be interesting to see if the state or somebody tries to say, hey, you guys need to look at this.
Eric?
And I think one of the things that they've talked about there is the idea that, you know, the first concern among Imperial Beach officials is the public infrastructure. Right. It's the stormwater drains that currently drain out into the ocean. If the ocean level rises too high, they're not going to be able to drain into the ocean. It's going to back up into the city. And that's something that's already happened during high tides. And they're also worried about public property. There's a school in the northern edge of Imperial Beach that is already feeling the effects during these higher tides and storm events. You know, their play field is already getting flooded. So that's something that they're already considering. And, you know, at some point they may have to move that school in order to keep providing that service to their population.
I wanted to emphasize the backdrop of our discussion today. Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg is leading students like her and many others in cities around the world, including San Diego, in a walkout protesting climate change. And this is in advance of the UN's Climate Summit, Monday, September 23rd. It's going to be interesting to see if the U.S. even participates in that, since President Trump and his new UN ambassador are climate deniers.
They have issued visas for a lot of people to come in specifically for that. So they may not be participating actively as a federal government, but they're also not becoming an obstacle to having this discussion in the United States.
And I will say another note on Imperial Beach, when you talk about this happening in other cities like San Diego is a huge city, Imperial Beach is very small. Their economy, you could say, really kind of depends on that main strip, which is literally right by the beach. And if that main strip is flooded, then they're out of luck.
Yeah, so the impact there is enormous.
And then it's, what do you do? Do you dump millions of dollars in building seawalls all around the city, or what do you do?
Right, huge question. All right, let's switch now from effects to cause. Trump administration this week announced it's blocking California from enforcing strict emission standards for cars and light trucks. And let's dive into that story, Eric. What happened exactly and what does it mean here?
Well, not a surprise what happened this week. This is something that the Trump administration telegraphed as soon as he got into office. He wanted to ease the fuel efficiency standards that the Obama administration passed in the last year of their administration. He issued 3 tweets in the middle of this week that said, we are revoking California's right to its waiver of the Clean Air Act. And what that waiver did was it allowed California to institute stricter air pollution standards on its vehicles, because California had this huge problem with smog. And the state wanted to do something aggressive to tackle that smog problem. And it just so happens that the same gases that cause smog are the same gases that cause global warming. And so that's kind of morphed into where California is heading. The Trump administration wants to roll back the limits. They want to take away California's right to set those higher standards, and they want to take away the ability of other states to follow those standards if they choose.
Yeah, and California has a huge impact because 13 other states were going to join them, and that's more than half of the cars sold in America. So this is a huge impact on this. We have a clip here from Governor Gavin Newsom here, and let's hear what he has to say about this move.
This is the game changer, and the Trump administration is hell-bent on rolling back all those Obama-era rules. So part of it's ego, and also, let's just be honest, and one has to be honest here, it's also about doing the bidding of big oil.
Matt?
Well, so the Trump administration is saying, no, we're the ones who set these standards, not you, California. But a number of automakers have already said, yeah, that's fine. We will voluntarily meet these standards. So where's the rub for the federal government here?
That's a good question. It's a fair question. It's one that's being asked publicly by Governor Gavin Newsom and Attorney General Becerra as well. The thing to understand about this particular change, it's unique in one very special way, right? When you pass a pollution law in this country, usually what you do is you set the bar and you say, look, we don't want you to pollute any more than this, and you have to get at least to this attainment level.
Right.
But if you pollute less, that's okay. We're going to allow you to do that. And in this case, what the Trump administration is saying, look, we're going to set this level and we're not going to allow you to pollute less. Right. We're going to require you to be at this level for the emissions from your cars.
Trump digs coal and he digs pollution. All right. Before we leave this segment, I should note, just before we came on the air, California joined 23 other states in suing the Trump administration over this action. All right, we are going to move on. In terms of lives lost and structures destroyed, of the 10 worst wildfires in California history, 7 have occurred in the past 2 years. So it should be no surprise the California National Guard has steadily increased its budget to fight fires. And Steve, how much now is the Guard spending the current fiscal year? A lot over just a few years ago.
Right. So we asked the California National Guard, how much are they being reimbursed over the last decade to fight wildfires? And no surprise, yeah, it's going way up. 2013, they spent about $5.6 million. Most of that was on aviation. By this year, it's $34 million. And a lot of the increase comes from, they're just simply putting more boots on the ground. They're using National Guard to fight the wildfires. And then starting this year, they're part of a new year-round task force that's being paid for through the governor's office to go around and build fire breaks around the state.
Yeah, that's a different kind of role, and I don't know if that's controversial or not. How does the Guard feel about that role, and what are they doing exactly, and what's their mission?
Well, the idea is somewhat controversial. A lot of critics will say that you can't build fire breaks around California. There was the deadly Camp Fire last year, and that a fast-moving wildfire like that wouldn't be stopped by fire breaks. But on the California National Guard side, they're up for it. They had a lot of volunteers. They were willing to do that. They're willing to perform this role year-round if that's what the governor wants them to do. It does cause a lot of dislocation. We talked to Major Robert Livingston, who lives down here in San Diego. But right after he came back from Baghdad in 2018, he had to go live up in Sacramento here so we could run this statewide task force. And so far, obviously, we've lost people from CAL FIRE in wildfires. We've never lost someone from the California National Guard. So that could change if we have a serious incident.
And this, it does not seem, it seems like the Guard is, and the military in general, who we'll talk about in a minute, are kind of walking a tightrope here, because, as we say, the Trump administration has basically a posture of denial on climate change, yet they're going to spend money and try to complete this mission.
Well, so part of the money that's being reimbursed is state money, and of course the state government completely acknowledges climate change. CAL FIRE put out a 29-page report that basically called for this task force to go around and build these fire breaks. That's all state money. When you talk about the federal money, this is all FEMA disaster relief money, the same money that goes into flooding, tornadoes, and things like that. So far that money hasn't been controversial.
Matt?
And where does this directive come from to kind of up their game here on this forest management? I mean, I know the president said that California has poor forest management.
We're not
is this something that
enough.
comes from, is this something that comes directly from Gavin Newsom, or is this something that the president wants them to do?
Well, we did hear after the Camp Fire, he was up in Paradise and he said that California needs to do more to manage its forests. Of course, a lot of that management needs to be done on federal lands, not state lands. The governor removed all of the California National Guard troops, or almost all of them, from the border. He took 100 to be part of this task force. He wanted the federal government to pay for that, following up on what President Trump had said. And so far, no, the state has picked up the cost of this.
All right, I wanted to shift to the other huge challenges the climate crisis poses for the military at large in this country. And one is, of course, sea level rise and damage to bases from natural disasters like Hurricane Michael, and that devastated the Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida Panhandle just a year ago. How is the military coping and planning? I mean, it's such a huge global problem, as we're saying.
So climate change presents somewhat of an interesting conundrum for the military. It sort of goes against two values. One of them is to stay out of anything political, and the other one is to plan for absolutely any contingency. The military has more than $1 trillion of real estate around the world. They know very well that climate change is impacting that real estate. When General Mattis was Secretary of Defense in 2017, he told the Senate that that climate change was impacting operations, not just real estate, but operations globally around the world. On the other hand, you've seen the Navy quietly shut down its task force to deal with global warming. That happened back in March. When you see a lot of there's a lot of planning. You see a lot of things that instead of saying climate change, you hear about sea level rise. A lot of the impact is being seen on the East Coast right now. We see rising sea levels, but it's not the rising sea levels that are the problem so much as storm surge. So when you get a hurricane, whether you believe that hurricane was caused by climate change or not, you see a storm surge that goes much farther inland, and that has caused billions of dollars worth of damage at Camp Lejeune, and there's been a continual flooding up in Norfolk, one of the largest military bases in the world.
And down in Imperial Beach, the Navy just rebuilt their Navy SEAL Training Center, and if you look at that facility, it's the highest land that you can. When they rebuilt it, they built it up to make sure that it can withstand the rigors of sea level rise that could happen there, and it's the highest land that you can see anywhere.
And there is concern. I mean, obviously, buds happens all along the strand there. In a storm surge, you could see that strand completely covered. So there's obviously an impact there. On the flip side, there was a report that came out from the General Accounting Office earlier this year that praised Naval Base San Diego. They had a very large pier project, a rebuild back last year. They did take into account climate change over the next 75 years when they built it higher than it would have been under the previous plans. Up at Camp Pendleton, there was a landing strip up there along, I think, near Red Beach. That was also, they took into climate change. So you can tell whether or not they get out on front, whether or not they use the term climate change. You can see the military working.
And the conflicts and we're going to talk about this in a minute in terms of global migration and all, but when people are desperate because of drought and lack of basic things like food and water, they're going to move and they're going to find that. I mean, it's just a natural thing and it's going to happen.
Literally, these conflicts could be caused by climate change. Here, people they say Syria, a large element of that was caused simply by famine and dislocation. And the military acknowledges that, as well as humanitarian efforts for hurricanes and floods around the world. And there are attempts to budget for that.
Yeah, Syria, you were talking about up to 1 million refugees from that civil war, but was preceded and still continues by 4 years of drought in a highly agrarian country. Yeah, so that's something the military has to deal with because people on the move.
And they acknowledge it. They acknowledge that.
Exactly. All right, we're going to move on and get a little deeper into this entire topic on migration. Humans have always been on the move to nearby places, to new worlds. Motivation varies from crusaders and conquerors to those fleeing repression or searching for new lands or a better life. Now, disasters associated with climate change are key factors causing mass migrations across the globe. How many migrants from climate are there? Determining the numbers and even the importance of climate change as a factor in migration is tricky business. But of the hundreds of thousands fleeing Central America and arriving at our southern border in the past year, a significant number left because climate change had ruined their agrarian livelihood. So Priya, explain how changing climate in many parts of the world is causing these huge number of people to move.
Yeah, so actually the World Bank projects that by 2050, we're going to see 140 million people moving because of climate change. And there's 3 specific regions of the world where we're seeing this happen the most. One is Latin America, which you just mentioned, and we're projecting, or the World Bank is projecting, that about 17 million people could potentially be migrating in the next 30 years because of climate change there. The highest number is in sub-Saharan Africa. There's 86 million people moving there. And then in South Asia, 40 million people. So, you know, Steve, we just talked about Syria, but I actually got a chance to also interview a Somali refugee.
Right.
And, you know, as you mentioned, the past 2 years, they've had a significant shortage of rainfall, which has really dramatically affected the lives of people who are living in rural areas and who depend on agriculture for their livelihood. So you're seeing those people then migrate to urban areas, and a lot of these areas are already dealing with political conflict. So then they end up in refugee camps, perhaps in other countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, and many of them end up here in Southern California. So it's really fascinating to watch this process from rural areas to then urban areas to then refugee camps to then potentially, a place like San Diego.
And of course, we've talked a lot on the show. Have a huge national debate and a debate as we move into the election season. Of course, on immigration policies, not only Donald Trump's wall at the southern border, but also asylum seekers, changing immigration, taking in folks and visas, the entire gamut of immigration. But the numbers you're talking about, the numbers in that World Bank study that we're talking about here, this is a global problem. It doesn't seem a wall or some tweaking of the immigration policy is going to begin to cover the number of people on the move.
And that's one of the things that the World Bank and the United Nations has been strongly advocating for. They say that we need to be proactive and that if we come up with programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we could cut those numbers, that 140 million projection, by potentially 80%. So, even though at the lowest levels, a lot of these people might not be necessarily realizing that they're moving because of climate change, a lot of people are saying that it's up to the policymakers and the politicians to really push that agenda and think of solutions so that we don't end up in that kind of crisis decades from now.
Eric?
You touched on that just a bit, and I'm kind of curious about that. The Somali people who end up here in San Diego, do they see themselves as being climate refugees, or do they see themselves as being political refugees?
Well, I think it's a combination, and they don't necessarily use that classification of I'm a climate refugee, but if you sit down and talk to them and hear their story, you'll see that it's a combination of all of these things. And usually the climate issues are what's exacerbating an already tense situation. So it's, the climate change that's leading to famine that's then causing these people to literally say, we need to find food and water for our families to survive. And what was particularly fascinating about that one Somali refugee that I interviewed was he had actually joined the Somali army, and that's how he at first initially came to the United States, was through the Defense Language Institute. He ended up at the Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. But he was saying that a lot of people join the army or other armed factions because just as a means to survival, and then that's feeding into all of this violence and tension that then the military has to deal with. So all of these issues really do go hand in hand.
Interconnected, Matt?
Yeah, Eric took the words right out of my mouth, that question. But I know when we talk about climate change, I know we're kind of painting a grim outlook here on what's happening. When you talk to people at the Institution of Oceanography, Scripps, they say they don't really know how much sea level is going to rise, but if we continue on a path, it's obviously going to rise. But Eric, I know we were talking before, this can sort of be reversed or halted, right?
Well, the thing is that the outcome is not certain. Whenever you talk to people, I ask this question a lot. We're concerned about sea level rise. How much is it going to rise and by when? It's the first question I ask. And nobody can really give you that answer. And it's because we still have a chance as residents of the United States, residents of the planet, to impact the outcome. So what they're saying is, look, if we dramatically reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere today, and that is sustained over the next decade, it will dramatically reduce the impact of climate change on our local.
Almost seems like common sense. Right.
Yeah, and one fascinating thing that the expert I spoke to, also from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, said was that this becomes a moral question, and the United States needs to take the lead. According to him, 50% of the pollution in the world is created by the wealthiest 1 billion people.
Yeah, we're only 4% of the world's population, but we have 25% and have just behind China in terms of the most polluting.
And he was saying that, there are 3 billion people all over the world who haven't even really discovered fossil fuels, and that this isn't something that they're creating, but these are the people who are being impacted.
They're going to be hit first.
Yeah, so he said, it's really up to us and other, developed nations that are creating this problem to really solve it.
Well, here's an interesting thing. We had the G7 summit here, of course, and President Trump notably didn't show up on Climate Change Day. We've got this thing I mentioned earlier next week on Monday with the UN. The U.S. going to be represented there.
Well, it's a weird question of whose responsibility is it? I know it seems like the Trump administration doesn't want to take the leap here. Talk about them pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. It's like,
I think a lot of the researchers acknowledge the fact that the federal government is not taking the lead on this, but I think they also see some encouragement in the fact that states like California, and there are other states around the United States that do take this seriously, and they're doing things on climate change, and they're trying to have a positive impact on the situation. So I think they take heart in that, and that's one of the reasons why the predicting exactly what's going to happen and when it's going to happen is so difficult for them.
And we're almost out of time, but it's so encouraging that you folks did these stories. We joined these news organizations everywhere doing this Climate March today. And the debate, the national debate, has changed so remarkably just in a couple of years, Eric.
Sure, and I think you'll see it all through the course of this next year as the presidential elections wind toward Election Day.
Right. We are about out of time, but we had that remarkable town hall just where 10 top Democrats vying for the presidential nomination all talked extensively at length about their plans. Well, we are out of time, but it was a terrific discussion. Appreciate all your reporting. And that does wrap up our special climate change edition of the KPBS Roundtable. And I'd like to thank my guests, all reporters from KPBS News, Eric Anderson, Priya Sridhar, Steve Walsh, and Matt Hoffman. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. Plenty of links to a lot of these stories and a lot of these studies that we've referenced here. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.